Well, there are two basic responses that one can observe. The first is that advocated by the great German theologian Rudolf Bultmann, who said that, okay, we know that Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure didn't really see himself as God incarnate, but that doesn't matter, because God himself is inspiring the church. The image of Jesus that was intended to be taken and to inspire the church and subsequent humanity was the image that has been traditionally read into the New Testament. And so, although the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith demonstrably are two different figures, it is the latter that we should be taking seriously as the basis for our Christology. And through this maneuver, which not everybody regards as particularly persuasive, he can actually justify the retention of the entire Chalcedonian and Pauline theology. The other response, of course, is to take the new discoveries seriously and to grasp the nettle and to say that the traditional Christian views about Jesus, the old Christology, was framed on the basis of information that we now know to be flawed. The modern New Testament scholarship, the Qumran discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so forth, no longer allow us as responsible objective historians to cling to the views developed by 3rd, 4th century Greek theologians who simply didn't have access to this material. Burton Mack is a distinguished American advocate of this thesis. So also is Professor Robert Eisenman, who recently published a book on James, the brother of Jesus. Eisenman's point in this huge 800-page tome is that the early Christian community divided into two, and that the brother of Jesus, James, is referred to in the Bible as the brother of the Lord, and Protestants certainly accept that Jesus did have brothers. Catholics don't, because of their doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. That the original disciples of Jesus and the early Jewish Christians remained in Jerusalem, continued to worship in the temple, and retained their loyalty to the Mosaic law. Whereas St. Paul, when he travelled out to the Jewish diaspora and eventually converted Gentiles as well, introduced Greek styles of religion, deified, divinized Jesus, and this was the reason for the tension which we know, even from the epistles of Paul, existed between him and the Jerusalem Christians. And Eisenman goes on to point out that in the year 70, when the temple was sacked and Jerusalem was razed to the ground, that the original Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem was more or less wiped out. Although we find people like the Ebionites in the 1st and 2nd century, and as late as the 5th century, who continued to believe that to be a Christian you had to be loyal to the Jewish law, as Jesus himself had taught. But following the destruction of the temple, the initiative in Christianity shifted to the new Gentile believers who rejected the law, didn't see the need for circumcision or the respect for the Jewish dietary laws and so forth, and that became the form of Christianity that eventually prevailed in history and was imposed by the Byzantine Empire. That's Eisenman's view. It's also upheld by somebody called Bernheim, who's a French scholar, who provoked quite a bit of controversy in Catholic circles in France a couple of years ago, and he produced a book also called James, the brother of Jesus, which makes the same point. And it's a very good case, and many Christian theologians are now figuring out what the correct response should be. Some, such as the British thinker John Hick, have said the old images of God and of the incarnation have to go. Clearly they are a historical product. Clearly it is illegitimate to project these Greek ideas back into the mouth of the very Jewish Jesus. We can retain Christianity, but we need to see the Trinity as some kind of symbol, poetic metaphor, rather than a realistic description of the divine nature. And John Hick, other theologians such as Don Cupid, and some Americans, to some extent somebody called Paul Knitter has been doing this as well, have been charting a post-Trinitarian Christology, which ties in, of course, with what the Unitarian movement has been saying for some years anyway. Now, I've talked about this in some detail because I think it is going to determine the tenor of Muslim-Christian relations in the decades to come, in the new millennium. And I think it's a very hopeful sign, because this great stumbling block between Muslims and Jews on the one hand, Christians on the other, namely the idea of the incarnation, which Muslims simply can't digest. God cannot inhere in anything he has created. He is outside the world, transcends the world. If that doctrine is jettisoned, if the Trinity is reformulated and regarded just as a poetic rather than a literal statement, well then there really isn't too much to divide Muslims and Christians, and a new era of understanding and dialogue can hopefully unfold. Something I wanted to close on. Often these discussions still proceed in mainstream theological circles without sufficient reference to their entailments for concepts of gender. And partly because of the several female colleagues I now have in Cambridge, I've been forced to acknowledge that many of the historic injustices imposed upon women have had theological and, in Christianity's case, Christological justifications. In America in particular, there has been a group of very articulate, challenging women theologians, Rosemary Ruther being the best known of them, who have said that it is profoundly alienating to modern women to worship a male God. The Trinity, according to Ruther, and the very considerable following that she now has, is alienating to women in anything like its traditional formulation because it's so male-centered. And as another American, Mary Daly, has said, if God is male, then the male is God. This seems to be an entailment, that there is a primacy attaching to the masculine principle in the very nature, the very ground of existence, and this can be used to justify every other inequality that has unfolded in history. The Trinity has not just God the Father, but also God the Son. God has chosen a male vessel for the incarnation. And the Virgin Mary is regarded increasingly as a rather ambivalent figure, as I mentioned earlier, because of her passivity and her saintliness as a product of her negation of her specifically feminine possibilities of motherhood. So, how does Islam fit into this? And what are the implications for this of the new, still rather tentative, trend in Christology? Well, one of the things John Hick does is to point out that immediately religion becomes more accessible and less alienating to women if this traditional Trinitarian language is set aside or poeticized. God the Father is a concept that a lot of modern, not just women, but people generally cannot accept, because it does seem to impute gender to the divine who should transcend that. So we find, for instance, even in liturgy now, the Lord's Prayer is now being amended. Our Father who art in heaven. A lot of women find this difficult. And there's a new inclusive language lectionary produced, I think, by the Episcopalian Church here, very widely used, which amends this and tries to get Father out of the equation. I think that the rather infelicitous alternative they propose is, O you to whom as loving children we belong, which gets around the gender specificity, but perhaps sounds somewhat sententious and absurd. But it's being used in a number of churches. This is a live issue. What John Hick is saying, what Ruther is saying, is that we need to redefine God so as not to attribute gender to God. And where this ties in interestingly with Muslim theology is that Islam never did that in the first place. One of the differences between the characterizations of God in the Bible and in the Quran is that the Quran does not call God Father. The divine tanzih, the divine transcendence, a word which we'll be discussing in more detail next week. God as utterly other, transcendent, beyond description, beyond comparison, precludes any attribution of gender to God, really or metaphorically. Interestingly too, there is a kind of ambivalence about the gender of the divine that you find in some of the hadith literature, and also in the Quran itself. God is described as Allah most frequently, which doesn't really look like a male or a female noun in Arabic, although it's treated grammatically as male because there's no neuter. But there is this frequently occurring word for the divine, Ar-Rahman, the all-compassionate or the all-loving. And at the beginning of the Quran, you get these words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So this is how God chooses to describe himself right at the beginning of the Quran. Now, Rahman is interesting because the Prophet himself said that this name has been derived from Rahmah. Ishtuqqat min ar-Rahmah. And Rahmah is min ar-Rahim. And Rahim is the Arabic word for a womb. Ar-Rahman is God in the creative aspect. Why did God create the world, according to the Muslim mystics? Well, it wasn't because he needed to as such, but because of his compassion. Muslim mystics say that he looked out upon the possible things that could exist, that were crying out to him inarticulately, for him to bestow upon them the blessing of existence, and because of his rahmah, his compassion, he breathed out and the world was born. And this is called the nafas ar-Rahman, the breath of the compassionate God. That's another way of seeing the created world. In Muslim mysticism, the breath of the compassionate God is what the world is. And Rahim has a specifically womb-like connotation. As I said, it's the usual Arabic word for a womb, and so some of the theologians explicitly aver that this is a feminine possibility within the divine. God's engendering, his maternal bringing into existence of the world. We also find in a number of hadith the concept of rahmah sketched out more fully. One of the points that sometimes arises in Muslim-Christian debate is that Christianity is a religion of love. Islam and Judaism are religions of the law. And this stereotype can also be tackled by looking at this term. It's conventionally translated as the compassionate. However, it's not a very good translation. If we look at the hadith, we find that something more intimate, more warm, more loving, more maternal is definitely implied. A famous hadith describes how when the Prophet finally conquered Mecca, and there was a scene of absolute confusion, people running everywhere, fearing a massacre, which of course didn't occur, he and his companions spotted a young woman who was running around crying, my child, because she'd lost her baby in the crush. And then she found the child and picked it up and hugged it to her breast. And the companions of the Prophet were so delighted to see this beautiful scene that some of them even wept with joy. And the Prophet looked at them and he was overjoyed to see their joy, and he said, Are you amazed at this woman's rahmah, her compassion for her son? I swear to you, by him in whose hands lies my soul, God shall show more rahmah to his believing servant on the day of judgment than this woman shows to her son. So again we find a kind of feminine possibility here, and again we find that rahmah is not legitimately translated or sufficiently translated just as compassion. It has this sense of personal love as well. And you won't read the Quran fully or correctly unless you recognize that this mistranslation needs to be corrected. There are other points that could be made in response to that particular point, such as there is a divine name, Al-Wadud, which is correctly translated as the loving or the loving kind. It's one of God's 99 names that I'll be talking about a bit more next week. So to say that Islam is not a religion of love, or Islam does not have the idea of a loving God, simply is not the case. God created existence precisely as an expression of his unconditional love.